All right, so today we're going to be going over the concept of specificity and what that means and how it relates to training in general and powerlifting specifically. So if we want to define that term, specificity, high specificity versus low specificity training, all that means is how similar is your training and what you're doing in the gym to your sport and what you're doing on the platform. So if we're going to talk about a sport unrelated to powerlifting, say basketball, a live scrimmage in practice is going to be your high specificity work. That's most similar to what you're doing in game. But if we're looking at weight training for a basketball player, that's going to be low specificity. That's not very similar to what they're doing on the court, but it's going to bring up general qualities that will help them in their practice and in their sport. And now when we're looking at powerlifting specifically, your high specificity work is going to be your high intensity, low rep squat, bench, deadlift work. And then the further away that we get from that, the less specific it's going to be. So the reason that high specificity training is so helpful and so useful is because there's no better practice than actually doing the thing that you're going to be doing in your sport, right? You're not going to get better at doing a competition squat unless you're doing the competition squat. But the downfall that comes with that, as a powerlifter you'll probably know, is that doing competition low bar back squats 3 days a week to high intensity, low reps, loading it as heavily as you can, is going to run you into the ground very, very quickly, right? You're not going to be able to sustain that for very long for most people. So we're able to target different qualities that are going to carry over into your competition squat without having all of the fatigue and the stress and probably the aches and pains that are associated with driving that specificity long term. Take squat, for example. So the highest specificity version or high specificity way that you can train squat as a powerlifter is going to be your competition squat. So most likely a low bar back squat with no pause, no tempo, right? The exact movement that you're going to be doing on the platform. And then as we get further and further away from that, we can do paused competition squats, paused low bar squats. We can do high bar squats. We can do SSB squats. And then getting even further away, we can do belt squat, leg press, hack squat. And then we're getting even further away. We have split squats, leg extensions. So there are a few reasons for getting further and further away from that high specificity, but essentially what we're doing is we're trying to target a different quality more specifically. So the reason that we might move from a typical competition low bar back squat to a pause squat is because we're trying to work on some center of mass management issues. Or if we're going like as far away as possible and we're going to a leg extension, we're probably just purely trying to get some quad stimulus, some quad hypertrophy going without all the stress that's related with a barbell back squat. So a really big part of program design really boils down to how specific do we want things to be, and then where are we putting that specificity within the program. So I think a big mistake that we've made historically just throughout powerlifting has been really associating the primary day with high specificity and then kind of going down the ranks in specificity as we go primary, secondary, tertiary. If we take squat, for example, again, that primary day, just generally speaking, is probably going to be your heaviest and most specific squat work, right? Your low bar competition squats that are loaded the most heavily are going to go on your primary day. And then as we go to a secondary day, that's probably where your high bar, your higher rep or your paused work goes. And then if you squat 3 times a week, maybe that's where your paused SSB work goes or something like that, where we're kind of branching out and going downwards in the ranking of specificity as we go into those quote unquote lower priority days. But if we're looking at the primary, secondary, tertiary model through a more modern lens, all we're really seeing is that primary day is where your indicator set throughout the week is, right? If we're looking at a powerlifting program, you've usually got that one set of 1, 2, 3, maybe 4 reps on squat, bench, and deadlift that's being used as your indicator of strength, and then the rest of your program is kind of modeled around that to have that indicator set trend upwards. And then outside of that indicator set, I don't think that the primary, secondary, and tertiary labels really have much meaning. All we need to do is work around that and then find a way for that set to trend up. Now, that's not to say that just because we're not looking at the primary, secondary, tertiary days as a ranking of specificity that we just program randomly, right? We still want some kind of relationship between days, but rather than ranking it through the lens of specificity, we're more so just looking at what tees this person up to be strong, right? You'll hear this concept of priming a lot. So if we're looking at a secondary and a primary day, the secondary is kind of used as a strength primer for the primary day, where we find out what does the person need on their Tuesday secondary deadlift to come in strong on their Saturday primary deadlift. What do we need to do in terms of sets, reps? What do we need to do in terms of load, in terms of variation, to have that person come into their Saturday session feeling the strongest that they can? And a lot of times that's going to line up really well with this model that we've always used with the ranking of specificity on primary and secondary days. You know, an athlete might need some lower intensity RDLs in their secondary day to come in really strong on competition deadlifts on their primary day. And then it works perfect and it's fine. But a lot of times it doesn't pan out. A lot of the times someone needs some highly specific work on their secondary day in order to come in strong on their primary. But if their total weekly workload is all competition deadlifts and you're pushing high specificity competition deadlifts on their secondary and their primary, they're going to overdo it and get hurt. Now we're in a situation where that old model doesn't really line up and we need to pivot. And that leads into what I think is a really important point, and kind of the main point of this video, is that your primed days, your primed sessions, your strongest sessions do not need to be your most specific sessions. It's intuitive to assume that on the days that you're strongest, the days that you can probably move the most weight, should be the days where you're pushing specificity the hardest and you are getting the most out of your competition movements. But again, for that reason that we just mentioned, doing that a lot of times is not going to be a sustainable approach for someone that just simply cannot tolerate that much competition deadlifting, competition squatting, competition benching. So that's when you're going to move to a strategy where you have these secondary days or just any non-primary day that's going to look a little bit more specific in terms of exercise prescription than your primary day. So you're teeing yourself up to be strong on the primary day, and then on your primary day, you are taking advantage of that strength with an exercise prescription that's going to be the most productive for you individually, not just what seems like it would do the most on paper because it's high specificity and that's going to transfer the best. So some easy examples of this. Let's take someone who gets really beat up from low bar squats. They get a lot of shoulder, elbow, bicep pain from pushing low bar squats twice a week. And then we try a layout for them, which is high bar squats on the secondary day or SSB squats on the secondary day. And then a typical primary layout, so we have a top single and then 3 or 4 sets of 5. And they're pain-free. They're not in pain. They're able to squat and not have any pain flare-ups, but they're weak, right? We're not getting that top end to go forward. They're coming into the primary feeling detrained. They're not feeling practiced. So we changed that secondary day to competition squatting. Now we have a full competition layout. They're feeling strong for a little bit. Once we pace into the heavy work, now they're in pain. So we have these two kind of different issues to where we have the specific primary and the non-specific secondary. They're not in pain, but they're weak. And then we have the opposite issue where we have a specific primary, specific secondary. They are feeling strong and then aren't able to actually pace into anything heavy because they just get hurt. This is a perfect situation where we might just want to have a high specificity secondary day where we're getting that low bar practice in at an intensity that we can determine they can handle. And then on the primary day, we give them that top set, and then the rest is SSB, the rest is high bar, the rest is whatever they need. Maybe it's even leg press if they can't handle it. And that way we can get productive training in while at the same time trying to build up that tolerance, right? We want to be able to handle specificity as a power lifter. You want to be able to get that work in as much as you can. But at the end of the day, you can't force that issue. You need to build up the tolerance as you're getting in training that is sustainable. So now we've kind of introduced the topic and gone over the general idea of just specificity as a whole in powerlifting. I want to go over a few case studies and get into the specifics of it to get a little bit clearer of a picture. Okay, so the first example that I want to go over is a case where we had a lot of fatigue overlap with squat and deadlift and had a lot of trouble pacing into a heavy squat by the end of the block. And we ended up going with a non-specific primary approach on deadlifts in order to let the top end on squat shine through. So go over the layout that we were working with, and I've erased any irrelevant info on the sheet, so we're only looking at these two sessions kind of in a vacuum and then going over load progression and then figuring out where we need to pivot after the end of this block in order to get a higher performing block. So on Tuesday, we had that's actually the last block. On Tuesday, we had a top single on sumo deadlifts, a top set of 3, and then 2 back down sets of 3 that are a minus percentage from that top set of 3. And then on squat, we have 3 ascending sets of 5 that are in the 65 to 72% range. And then on the Saturday session, we have a top triple on squats and then 3 ascending sets of 4 on high bar squats, with that first set being comp squat. And then for the secondary deadlift exposure on that Saturday, we have 2 sets of 7 on RDLs with a prescribed load of 175 and 185. Now, we've been running this kind of layout for a bit with all the squat and deadlift exposures being on the same days. So we have the primary deadlift and secondary squat on one day, and then primary squat and secondary deadlift on another day. We've just found that having more than 2 lower body exposures per week isn't sustainable throughout a block, and we kind of need to have those lower body hits be on the same day. So we'll look at the load progression throughout this block and then kind of figure out what went wrong. So we look up here, we have a chart of the week-to-week top sets. So we have 192.5 kilos for a triple at RPE 6 on week 1, 200 kilos for a triple at RPE 7 on week 2, 210 for a triple at RPE 9 on week 3, and then 210 for a double at RPE 10 on week 4. So we definitely start to see things fizzle out a little bit on the week 3, where 210 for 3 at RPE 9 is probably a little bit overshot. And then week 4, 210 for a double at RPE 10 is very objectively lower performing than that week 3, where we were expecting 220 to 225 for the top set on this session, and cut the load at the last warm up and was not able to get the top set for a triple. Ended up having to cut it at a double because the second rep was too hard. So what we're seeing happen is basically this squat pattern just start to die out midway through the block because we're overdoing it with the amount of exposures per week, where we have sumo deadlifts early in the week that are loaded very heavily. And that's kind of a pseudo squat pattern for a lot of people. It's not going to be super dissimilar from their comp squat pattern, depending on how they squat and depending on how they deadlift. But for my athlete here, the patterns were pretty similar. So having all of these heavy sets, having essentially 4 relatively heavy sets all in the same session, followed by 3 sets of 5 on comp squats, and then going into the primary squat later in the week, the expectation of squatting heavy is just completely unreasonable, and it wasn't going to happen. So what we did and what we pivoted towards was we had the primary deadlift single still happening on that Tuesday. So we have that one heavy exposure on the sumo deadlifts, and then we moved the RDL work to the primary day. So we have a top set on the competition movement, and then the 2 back downs on something more non-specific that's not going to have a whole lot of overlap with the competition squat pattern. And then the primary deadlift and the primary squat and the secondary deadlift, we have the same layout on squats, but we have some paused sumo deadlifts here at a lower RPE. So we're not pushing that pattern super, super hard, but we're also getting that second sumo deadlift exposure on the session where we're already having that comp squat pattern. So there's not as much room for those patterns to actually overlap throughout the week. So what we're doing is we're getting enough of that sumo deadlift workload in throughout the week and throughout the block in order for it to get pushed forward, but we're not loading it heavily enough and in a way that is going to interfere with the squat top end too much. Additionally, what we're doing is we are putting the RDLs on a session that he's strong, and we're able to get a little bit more out of them, right? We're able to be a little bit more productive with the RDL work because we're putting them on a session where he's ready to load some heavier weight. And that heavy weight, again, is not going to interfere with his squat as much as sumo deadlifts would. And then if we're going to go up here and look at how that experiment went in relation to the last block, here we have 185 for 3 at an RPE 6. We started with a little bit lower of a baseline because we were at some pretty high levels of fatigue coming out of that last block. 195 for 3 at RPE 7 on week 2, 210 for a triple at RPE 8 on week 3, and then 225 for a triple at RPE 9 on week 4. So 15 kilos heavier and an extra rep on that week 4 set on this layout relative to the last layout. So very objectively higher performing block when we switched from the high specificity primary, low specificity secondary, and then flip those two. So I think this is a really good example of a situation where we're not really changing the weekly workload too much. All we're doing is rearranging. We're putting stuff in different places and getting a different outcome because of it. And in this situation, taking that higher specificity back down work on the primary and flipping it with the work that we were doing on the secondary, and simply just not having as high specificity and exercise prescription on the primary day led to significantly better outcomes. And our next example is going over a bench layout. Now, again, I've removed everything that's not relevant to the actual bench micro, so we're just looking at each bench set. We have a 4 times per week bencher right here who's just doing pure competition bench on all 4 of these sessions. And a problem that we were running into was a flare up or an increase in back pain as we would progress throughout the block through pushing into the ground and creating an arch through the leg drive. So this layout that we have right here, we have 3 ascending sets of 6 on the Monday. We have a single and then some sets of 4 on the secondary on Tuesday. We have a Thursday session with 3 ascending sets of 7 up to an RPE 6. And then we have a primary on Saturday with a top single and top set of 5, and then 3 back down sets of 5. So I'd say a pretty standard bench layout here. And if we're looking at the progression through the block, it's a little bit different than the last case that we looked at. We have 125 for 1 at an RPE 6, 130 for 1 at an RPE 7, 132.5 for 1 at an RPE 7.5, and then 127.5 for a single at an RPE 7. So we're not seeing like a fail or an RPE 10 set. We're just seeing an inability to actually get weight onto the bar because that back pain gets too high at the end of the block to load top end and to get to an RPE 9. So we're not detraining, not getting weaker throughout the block. We just have an inability to actually load because pain gets to a point where it makes it too much of an issue. Now, through past data with this athlete, we know that we can't really get away with a lower frequency on bench. If we reduce frequency, then we're going to see strength trend down. And if we take away these higher specificity exposures before bench, we're also going to see things trend down because we need these earlier exposures within the week for that single to come in strong, or else it's just going to come in flat and detrained. So what we went with was a very similar layout, but where the specificity for the most part is just coming from these quaternary and tertiary sessions. And we're just getting in some pressing hypertrophy work after our singles on the primary and secondary days. So right here, I changed the reps to be a bit lower on the quaternary bench session so that we're not getting all of our specificity through super high reps. So we have 3 ascending sets of 4 out of 5, 6, 7. On the Monday, secondary bench, we have a top single followed by 3 by 8 of feet up dumbbell press. So letting the back relax after we get that comp single in. And then on Thursday, we have the 3 ascending sets of 7, same thing as before, and then top single, and then 3 by 10 feet up dumbbell press. So we're bringing the comp bench workload down throughout the week and throughout the block. So we're at a threshold of sets that isn't going to flare up the back to the point where it's going to hurt our ability to pace into the end of the block. And that was the idea, at least. And then we look at how things paced into the week 4. And we've got 125 for a single at RPE 6, 130 for a single at RPE 7, 135 for a single at RPE 8, and then 140 for a single at RPE 9. So a much cleaner progression throughout the block, whereas before, we're not seeing this massive decrease in strength. We're just seeing an inability to actually get weight on the bar, and here we've kind of gained that ability to get weight on the bar through manipulating the specificity. And that's pretty much it. So I hope you were able to take something from this video to be able to implement either into your own training or your training system as a whole. And if you have any questions about the topics that went over, feel free to leave a comment or just shoot me a DM on Instagram at TSP_Chris. Thank you so much for watching.